Welcome to the History Maps podcast. It is the year 1719. You are a prisoner rotting in a Paris jail.
Right. A terrible place to be.
Yeah, the stone walls are damp, the food is practically inedible, and your prospects are bleak. But suddenly, the guards approach you with a deal. You can have your freedom right now, today.
But there is a catch.
A very specific, non-negotiable catch. You have to marry a prostitute whom you have never met. The two of you will be chained together, marched to a port, and immediately forced onto a ship bound for a mosquito-infested swamp on the other side of the world called Louisiana. You will never see France again.
It sounds like a dystopian novel. I mean, it really does. But that was a very real, documented policy. And it perfectly encapsulates the sheer desperation of the subject we are exploring today. We are taking a comprehensive look at the French colonization of the Americas, a key chapter in our History of the Americas series.
And when you dig into the historical records of this period, the scale of French ambition is almost difficult to comprehend.
Oh, for sure. By the time we hit the early 1700s, around 1710, the first French colonial empire covered an area of over 10 million square kilometers.
10 million. Just for a modern perspective, that is roughly the size of the entire continent of Europe. It made France the second largest colonial empire on Earth, trailing only Spain.
Right.
You look at a map from that era, and the French claim stretches from the jagged, freezing coasts of Newfoundland all the way across the Great Lakes, down the entire length of the Mississippi River to the sweltering heat of the Gulf of Mexico.
And they didn't stop at the mainland, They carved out highly lucrative footholds in the Caribbean and even tried to build colonies deep into the Brazilian rainforest.
So the map projects absolute, unchallenged imperial dominance.
But the reality on the ground was a constant, grueling struggle simply to exist. That is the central paradox we're going to unpack. France drew a line around half of the Western Hemisphere, yet this vast empire was continually crippled by a severe lack of manpower, punishing weather, and relentless geopolitical rivalry.
Because a map is merely a declaration of intent, really. Building an actual civilization requires people, it requires infrastructure, and it requires an economic engine that can sustain them.
Yeah, and as we will see, the French state went to incredibly desperate lengths to find those people.
So how did they build this colossal footprint? Why did they resort to chaining prisoners together to populate it? And what were the structural flaws that ultimately caused the whole thing to dissolve? Let's start at the beginning.
Well, before France could build its sprawling network of inland forts, they had to figure out how to survive the environment.
Right, and the first century of French exploration, roughly from the 1520s through the late 1500s, was essentially a string of disastrous, bloody failures trying to copy Spain's homework.
You have to understand the geopolitical panic of the 16th century. Spain had stumbled into world-altering wealth in Central and South America. They were extracting literal mountains of silver from places like Potosi.
Which was fundamentally changing the global economy.
Spot on. Francis I, the King of France, watched Spanish galleons returning filled with treasure. France could not afford to be left behind. But initially his goal wasn't necessarily to settle the cold, forbidding north. He wanted a shortcut.
Ah, the elusive passage to the Pacific.
Yes. He wanted a route through or around the American continent to reach the Pacific Ocean, to access the established, lucrative spice trade of Asia without having to deal with the Ottoman Empire or the Portuguese who controlled the eastern routes.
So in 1524, Francis I hires Giovanni da Verrazzano, an Italian-born explorer, to find that route. Verrazzano sails the coast all the way from Florida up to Newfoundland.
And he starts naming things to stake a claim.
Naturally. He calls the vast stretch of land Francesca and also Nova Gaul. And for anyone familiar with modern American geography, Verrazzano makes a crucial discovery parts of New York Harbor.
Yes, the records show the French held narrow land ports in what are now the boroughs of Queens and Brooklyn. They maintained some level of control there until 1609, when the British and the Dutch finally pushed them out.
So Verrazzano essentially performed a grand reconnaissance mission. He put the North American coastline on the French intellectual map.
But recognizing a coastline from the deck of a ship is vastly different from building a life there.
Yeah, totally. A decade later, in 1534, Francis I sends Jacques Cartier on the first of three major voyages. Cartier explores the coast of Newfoundland and navigates into the St. Lawrence River. He officially founds New France by planting a wooden cross on the shore of the Gaspé Peninsula.
Planting a cross makes for a great painting. I mean, it looks very imperial, but the actual attempts to settle were brutal.
Cartier tries to create the first permanent European settlement in North America at Cap Rouge, near present-day Quebec City. This is in 1541.
And he brings a substantial group, around 400 settlers.
But they abandoned the entire settlement the very next year. The weather was a nightmare, and they faced continuous attacks from the indigenous populations.
The primary enemy was the environment itself, specifically the winter and the resulting disease. The colonists experienced scurvy, which is a horrific condition.
Right, vitamin C deficiency.
Yeah, when you lack vitamin C for months on end, your body essentially stops maintaining its connective tissue. Your gums swell and bleed, your teeth fall out, and old, healed wounds actually break open. Cartier's men were dying in agony in the snow, entirely unprepared for the sheer length and brutality of a Canadian winter.
And they clearly hadn't learned their lesson by the end of the century. In 1598, the Crown decides to try settling Sable Island off the coast of Nova Scotia. And their brilliant strategy for populating it. They dump a group of convicts there.
Just maroon them.
Yeah, you maroon ill-equipped prisoners on a barren, windswept sandbar in the North Atlantic without a reliable supply chain. Shockingly, it failed rapidly.
These northern outposts were isolated death traps, so it is logical that French ambitions temporarily shifted south to a much warmer climate.
But that resulted in an even more disastrous outcome, the conflict in French Florida. This is a wild story. In 1562, King Charles IX, advised by Admiral Gaspard de Coligny, sends a man named Jean Ribault and a group of Huguenots to establish a colony.
They sailed to the Atlantic coast and found Charles Fort on Port Royal Island in present-day South Carolina. Now, the term Huguenot is critical here.
Right, the French Protestants.
Exactly. France was being torn apart domestically by sectarian violence between Catholics and Protestants. Establishing a colony in the Americas was partially seen as a way to siphon off some of this religious tension.
Provide a haven for Protestants far away from Paris.
Yes. Ribault establishes Charles Fort, leaves the colonists there, and returns to France for supplies. But he gets caught up in the religious wars back home and cannot return. The abandoned colonists eventually build a makeshift boat and try to sail back across the Atlantic. They resort to cannibalism before being rescued by an English ship.
Unbelievable. Yet, they try again. In 1564, René Guérin de Ligonier leads another group further south and founds Fort Caroline on the St. Johns River in modern-day Florida.
And this is where the geopolitics become incredibly volatile. Spain already claims Florida. More importantly, Fort Caroline is positioned uncomfortably close to the Gulf Stream.
The exact ocean current Spanish treasure fleets used to return to Europe.
That is the issue. From the Spanish perspective, a French fortress on the Florida coast is not just a territorial violation, it is a pirate base pointing a dagger at the economic jugular of the Spanish Empire.
Furthermore, the Spanish were militantly Catholic.
Right. The presence of French Protestants was viewed as a religious contagion that had to be eradicated.
The response is swift. In 1565, Pedro Menendez de Avilés sails up with a Spanish force and founds St. Augustine, just 60 kilometers south of the French fort. The chessboard is set.
Ribault, who had finally returned to Florida, realizes the threat and plans a preemptive naval strike against the Spanish.
But a hurricane hits, completely destroying the French fleet and scattering the survivors down the coast.
Which leaves Fort Caroline virtually undefended. Menendez de Avilés marches his men overland through the hurricane, takes the French fort by surprise, and slaughters almost everyone inside.
And when he later captures the shipwrecked French sailors, including Ribault, he demands they convert to Catholicism. When they refuse, he executes them on the beach at a place still called Matanzas, which literally translates to slaughters.
It was a complete and utter defeat for the French.
Wait, I have to stop here. If you look at this first century freezing to death at Cap Rouge, starving on Sable Island, getting massacred by the Spanish in Florida, it looks like a reckless operation burning through capital and lives without any viable strategy. Why didn't the French crown just cut their losses and give up on the Americas entirely?
Because yielding the Americas meant yielding the future of Europe. The wealth flowing into Spain from the New World was funding Spanish armies that were a direct threat to French borders.
So they couldn't just walk away.
No. The geopolitical calculus of the 16th century dictated that the cost of not trying was far higher than the cost of failure. France had to tolerate these horrific losses. The Crown essentially treated the colonists as disposable assets, hoping one of these ventures would eventually hit the geopolitical jackpot.
So, if brute force military occupation in the sunny South gets you wiped out by the Spanish, the French crown had to completely rewrite its playbook. They realized they couldn't conquer with armies in the south.
They had to pivot back to the deep freeze the north.
And this is where the entire character of the French Empire changes. They stop looking for gold and start looking for fur.
This economic shift is profound. In Europe, the fashion for broad-brimmed felt hats had exploded. The best material for making waterproof, durable felt was the soft undercoat of the beaver.
But the beaver populations in Europe had been hunted nearly to extinction.
Yes, North America, however, possessed an inexhaustible supply.
But extracting fur is completely different from mining silver or growing sugar.
Precisely the point. To run a silver mine, you build a fortress, enslave the local population, and force them underground. To grow sugar, you clear-cut the forest and build a huge plantation. But a beaver is a wild animal spread across thousands of miles of wilderness.
You cannot conquer the forest. You have to navigate it.
The French realized they couldn't just build a brick-and-mortar corporate headquarters. They had to build a gig economy. They needed independent contractors to trap the animals and bring the pelts to them.
Even with this new strategy, the early days were still an absolute nightmare. In 1599, they set up a tiny fur trading post in Tadoussac, where the Saguenay River meets the St. Lawrence. 16 men stay for the winter. By spring, only 5 are left alive.
Scurvy and the cold simply annihilated them. The learning curve was incredibly steep and paid for in blood.
They tried moving further east. In 1604, Pierre de Guatemala and Samuel de Champlain found a colony in Acadia on St. Croix Island. But scurvy hits them hard again.
So they moved the settlement the next year to Port Royal, in present-day Nova Scotia. They are slowly, agonizingly figuring out how to endure the climate, eventually learning from the indigenous people how to brew a tea from cedar and spruce needles.
Which provided the vital vitamin C needed to cure the scurvy. Armed with a bit more survival knowledge, Samuel de Champlain makes the breakthrough in 1608. He founds a permanent fur trading post on a strategic cliff overlooking the St. Lawrence River.
That post becomes the city of Quebec, the eventual capital of New France. And because of the unique mechanics of the fur trade we just talked about, Champlain is forced to establish a foreign policy completely unlike the Spanish or the British.
Champlain understands that a few dozen Frenchmen cannot harvest enough pelts to make the colony profitable. He needs the indigenous networks.
So he actively allies France with the Huron and the Ottawa nations. But those alliances come with a heavy price. By aligning with the Huron, Champlain automatically aligns France against their traditional enemies, the powerful Iroquois Confederacy.
The French provide European-manufactured goods, iron tools, and vital military support with firearms. In exchange, the Native Americans provide the beaver pelts, the deep geographic knowledge of the interior, and the birch bark canoes.
The legal framework the French build around this relationship is fascinating. In 1627, Cardinal Richelieu, the chief minister of France, issues an ordinance, a formal decree.
It explicitly declares that any Native American who converts to Catholicism is legally a natural Frenchman.
The exact text states they can come, live in France, acquire property, donate, and inherit legacies just like true French subjects without needing any letters of naturalization.
This legal integration extended to social practices as well. Because there was an acute shortage of French women in the early colony, frequent intermarriages occurred between French fur traders, the coureurs des bois, and Native American women.
This blending created a distinct new cultural group known as the Métis people, who played a crucial role as intermediaries in the fur trade.
You often see historians point to this era to contrast French benevolence with British cruelty. The records cite the 19th century historian Francis Parkman, who famously wrote that Spanish civilization crushed the Indian, English civilization scorned and neglected him, but French civilization embraced and cherished him.
Parkman's quote is a classic piece of historiography that highlights the assimilationist policy of the French compared to the exclusionary policies of their rivals.
Wait, I have to challenge that narrative. Is Parkman just romanticizing a desperate situation? When I look at the numbers, this 1627 decree from Richelieu doesn't look like genuine enlightened benevolence. It looks like sheer pragmatic panic. France had practically zero citizens in the woods. Weren't they just forced to play nice because if they didn't, they'd be slaughtered?
You are hitting on the fundamental truth of New France. It was deeply rooted in demographic weakness. You simply cannot subjugate a local population when you are perpetually outnumbered.
Right. The British could afford to be exclusionary because they were flooding the eastern seaboard with hundreds of thousands of settlers, physically pushing indigenous groups off the land.
The French needed the indigenous people alive, active, and cooperative. They relied on them entirely to navigate the waterways, to hunt the pelts that kept the colony solvent, and to defend the tiny French outposts against the Iroquois.
The policy of inclusion, while legally dressed up in the language of Catholic Brotherhood, was a raw strategy for survival.
If the French had alienated their indigenous allies, New France would have been wiped off the map in a single season.
But by embracing indigenous technology, specifically the birch bark canoe, the French unlocked the continent. They realized that the vast river networks of North America were essentially a pre-built highway system.
The canoe is a marvel of engineering lightweight, capable of carrying heavy loads of fur and easily carried over land during portages.
Using these rivers, a microscopic French population could suddenly project power deep into the interior, far beyond the Appalachian Mountains that were boxing the British colonists in on the East Coast.
The rivers were the arteries of the empire. In the 1670s, this expansion accelerates dramatically. On May 17, 1673, Louis Joliet, an explorer, and Jacques Marquette, a Jesuit priest, begin traveling down a huge waterway.
The local Sioux people called it Does Tongo, and the Miami, Illinois called it Mississippi, meaning the Great River. We know it as the Mississippi.
Joliet and Marquette travel far enough south to confirm a vital piece of geographical intelligence.
That the Mississippi River flows south into the Gulf of Mexico, not west into the Pacific. The dream of a shortcut to Asia dies, but a new imperial vision takes its place.
That realization is profound. It means the interior of the continent is connected by a continuous water route from the frigid Great Lakes all the way to the subtropical southern coast.
So in 1682, René Robert Cavelier, Sieur de La Salle, and his lieutenant Henri de Tonty decide to finish what Marquette and Joliet started. They travel the entire length of the Mississippi down to its delta.
In April, they arrive at the Gulf, plant a cross in the mud, and claim the entire river basin for King Louis XIV, naming it Louisiana.
Claiming it is one thing, holding it is another. Henri de Tonty leaves 6 men near a Quapaw village in 1686, establishing the Arkansas Post, the first European settlement in the lower Mississippi Valley. But La Salle's grand ambition to secure the mouth of the river ends in a spectacular disaster.
He goes back to France, gathers 4 ships and 320 colonists, and sails back to find the Mississippi Delta from the ocean side.
Finding a specific river mouth from the open ocean in the 17th century was incredibly difficult. The delta is a shifting maze of mudbanks and bayous.
Furthermore, navigators of that era could easily calculate their latitude, how far north or south they were, by looking at the sun or stars, but they had no reliable way to calculate longitude, their east-west position. La Salle's fleet misses the Mississippi entirely.
They sail hundreds of miles too far west, landing on the coast of Texas in 1685. The situation deteriorates rapidly. Ships sink, supplies rot, disease spreads, and the local Karankawa people attack them.
In 1687, desperate to find help, La Salle takes a small group and tries to walk overland to reach the French posts in Illinois. But his own men, exhausted and furious with his disastrous leadership, mutiny and murder him in the Texas brush.
It is a grim end, but the strategic imperative for France doesn't die with La Salle. The Crown knows they must secure the southern end of this colossal river highway.
If the Spanish or the British build forts at the mouth of the Mississippi, they can choke off the entire interior trade network of New France.
This leads to the efforts of 2 brothers from Canada who are tasked with anchoring the south, Pierre Le Moyne d'Iberville and Jean-Baptiste Le Moyne, Sieur de Bienville.
In 1699, Iberville manages to find the mouth of the Mississippi and builds a precarious little outpost nearby called Fort Maurepas, or Old Biloxi. In 1702, they push further along the coast and establish the settlement of Mobile in present-day Alabama.
Mobile provides a perfect window into the agonizing daily reality of trying to build a colony in the Gulf Coast swamps. Bienville is appointed royal governor, and they established the first French Catholic parish there in 1703.
But setting up institutions is easy. Keeping people alive is the real challenge.
The historical records give us a terrifying vignette from 1704. A French supply ship named the Pelican arrives in Mobile. It brings 23 young French women recruited to marry the settlers. But during a layover in the Spanish port of Havana, the ship had picked up something else.
Yellow fever. The ship was carrying the Aedes aegypti mosquito, the vector for the virus. The disease hit the settlement like a hammer.
The virus attacks the liver, causing jaundice, hence the yellow, and leads to severe internal bleeding, often resulting in patients vomiting coagulated blood. It devastated the French colonists and swept through the neighboring indigenous communities.
And the harsh realities of Mobile didn't stop at disease. The records explicitly note that during this same early period, the first enslaved Africans are brought to the region aboard a French supply ship from the Caribbean colony of Saint-Domingue.
Which marks the insidious beginning of the plantation economy attempting to take root in the southern mainland.
The demographic instability was wild. Mobile grew to 279 people by 1708, but 2 years later, disease had killed 100 of them, shrinking the population back to 178. You cannot build an empire when you are losing a third of your population to a fever in 24 months.
Add natural disasters to the mix. The Mobile River floods repeatedly, washing away their infrastructure. By 1711, Bienville throws his hands up and orders the entire settlement dismantled and moved several miles downriver to higher ground.
They build a new earth and timber fort there. Eventually, the capital of the Louisiana Territory shifts to Biloxi in 1720, and Mobile is left as a regional military outpost, eventually fortified with brick and renamed Fort Condé.
The story of Mobile, the yellow fever, the floods, the desperate introduction of enslaved labor demonstrates just how fragile the French grip on the Gulf really was. They were claiming millions of square miles, but they barely had enough healthy bodies to man the wooden palisades of a single fort.
And that demographic crisis is the defining fatal flaw of the French Empire in the 18th century. By the early 1700s, France has essentially drawn a massive border around North America.
They have the network from Quebec all the way down to New Orleans, which Bienville founds in 1718. But inside that border, the empire is effectively empty.
The numbers dictate the eventual outcome of the whole colonial enterprise. The data is stark. By the middle of the 18th century, leading up to the 7 Years' War, the British population on the eastern seaboard outnumbered the French population in North America 20-1.
Let me repeat that, because it is the most important statistic of the era. 20-1. There were roughly 1 million British colonists squeezed between the ocean and the mountains, looking west to perhaps 60,000 French colonists spread over a territory the size of Europe.
You cannot defend 10 million square kilometers against a highly motivated, densely packed rival with those odds. The French crown recognized this crisis early on and tried various state-sponsored methods to fix it.
Back in 1663, King Louis XIV tried to fix the gender imbalance. The colony was full of fur traders and soldiers, but very few women.
So the king sponsors a program sending between 800 and 900 young women, known as the Filles du Roi, or the King's Daughters, to New France. The state paid for their passage and provided a dowry, essentially paying them to marry the settlers and start families.
The program did have a significant impact. The population of New France grew from about 2,500 in 1663 to 15,000 by 1689. The birth rate surged.
But growing to 15,000 people over 30 years is a rounding error when your British neighbors are expanding by the hundreds of thousands.
The desperation reaches a fever pitch when you look at Louisiana in the early 1700s. A Scottish financier named John Law takes control of the economic management of Louisiana through the Mississippi Company. He realizes the territory is practically deserted. In 1718, there are only 700 Europeans in all of Louisiana.
John Law launches a propaganda campaign across Europe, portraying Louisiana as a paradise of abundant gold and easy living. He manages to convince about 800 voluntary immigrants to go, doubling the population.
He specifically targets German farmers from the Alsace region and Swiss laborers, settling them just upriver from New Orleans on what becomes known as the German coast. These highly skilled farmers essentially saved New Orleans from starvation.
But the propaganda wears off. The reality of the swamp becomes known, and voluntary immigration plummets. John Law and the Mississippi Company need warm bodies to justify the huge financial bubble they have built in Paris. When people stop volunteering, the state resorts to outright coercion.
Which brings us back to the prison marriages we talked about at the very beginning. Starting in September 1719, the French government begins clearing out the jails and hospitals of Paris.
They offer male prisoners their freedom under the strict condition that they marry a female inmate, usually a convicted prostitute. The authorities literally chain these newly minted couples together, march them to the western ports, and load them onto ships bound for Louisiana.
It is breathtakingly cynical. The government is essentially treating human beings as construction materials. They're sweeping the marginalized, the sick, and the criminalized off the streets of the capital and deporting them to serve as human infrastructure for an imperial claim.
It was a disaster on every level. The administrators in Louisiana were furious. They needed blacksmiths, carpenters, and farmers who knew how to clear land and grow crops.
Instead, ships were arriving full of traumatized, malnourished urban prisoners who possessed zero agricultural skills and had absolutely no desire to be in a humid wilderness.
The complaints from the colony were so loud that the government actually had to officially halt the deportations in May 1720. But they were so desperate for numbers that they ignored their own ban and sent the third shipment of prisoners in 1721 anyway.
This systemic failure to generate organic, voluntary immigration is the defining difference between the French and British empires. And we have to ask why. Why were the British leaving their homes in droves while the French stayed put?
The answer lies in domestic economics and religious policy. In England, you had massive economic upheaval. You had the enclosure movement. Wealthy landowners were literally fencing off common lands to raise sheep for the wool trade, violently pushing thousands of peasant farmers off land their families had worked for centuries.
These displaced people flooded into the cities, found no work, and became deeply desperate. To them, a dangerous ocean voyage to America looked like salvation.
Furthermore, England had intense religious splinter groups. The Puritans, the Quakers, the Catholics in Maryland, these were highly motivated, cohesive communities experiencing severe persecution. They possessed a collective ideological drive to leave the mother country and build a new society from scratch.
And France.
France was the opposite. The French peasantry, despite being heavily taxed and generally impoverished, were legally and culturally tied to the land. There was no widespread enclosure movement pushing them out. They had a deep attachment to their ancestral villages.
More importantly, the French crown made a fatal strategic error regarding religion. The Huguenots, the French Protestants who were facing brutal persecution and actually wanted to leave France, were strictly forbidden from settling in New France.
The crown insisted the colony remain purely Catholic.
So let me get this straight. The French government is so desperate for people that they are chaining criminals together and shipping them across the Atlantic, but simultaneously, they are legally banning thousands of highly motivated, skilled Protestant citizens from going, simply because they pray differently.
That is the exact contradiction. By artificially limiting the pool of potential immigrants strictly to Catholics who had no economic reason to leave, the French state engineered its own demographic doom.
The analogy that comes to mind is that the French North American Empire was like a magnificent, sprawling mansion. From the outside, on a map, the architecture looks beautiful and intimidating. But when you walk up and open the front door, the entire house is hollow. There are no support beams. It completely lacked the structural integrity of a population to hold the walls up against the wind.
And while North America was an agonizing struggle for basic survival and population numbers, the historical records reveal that the French were simultaneously attempting to build a completely different type of empire much further south.
Down in South America and the Caribbean, the motivation wasn't the slow, grueling fur trade. It was the pursuit of rapid, immense agricultural wealth. The climate in the South allowed for cash crops, and that changed the entire equation.
Let's look at their attempt to take a piece of Brazil. The colony was called France Antarctique, founded in 1555 by a man named Nicolas Durand de Villegagnon.
Villegagnon is a fascinating character. He was a Catholic knight of the Order of Malta, but he convinced the French crown to fund an expedition to Guanabara Bay, which is modern-day Rio de Janeiro.
His stated goal was twofold: secure a base for the valuable Brazil wood trade, and create a religious haven where persecuted Huguenots could live freely. He arrives with 2 ships and 600 soldiers and colonists, and they construct Fort Colonial on an island in the bay.
And initially he plays the geopolitical game well. The Portuguese claim Brazil, so Villegagnon immediately forms alliances with the local Tamoyo and Tupatamba indigenous groups who are actively fighting the Portuguese.
It is the exact same strategy as Champlain would use 50 years later in Canada. Leverage indigenous rivalries to secure your own precarious foothold. The colony seems stable at first. The Portuguese haven't attacked yet, so Villegagnon sends word back to Europe asking for more colonists to solidify the settlement.
In March 1557, a relief fleet arrives, carrying about 300 new people. But crucially, this group includes a contingent of 14 strict Calvinists from Geneva, specifically sent by the influential Protestant theologian John Calvin himself.
This is where the story goes completely off the rails. The arrival of these Calvinists triggers a massive theological dispute with Villegagnon. And they aren't arguing over how to defend the fort, they are arguing over the Eucharist, the communion bread and wine.
It sounds absurd to modern ears, but we have to understand 16th century theology. The Catholic position, which Villegagnon held, is transubstantiation, the belief that the bread and wine literally become the physical body and blood of Christ during the Mass.
The Calvinist position is that the bread and wine are purely symbolic, a memorial of Christ's sacrifice.
The dispute becomes toxic immediately. By October 1557, Villegagnon is so enraged by what he considers horrific heresy that he physically banishes the Calvinists from the island fortress.
They are forced to live among the Tupinambal on the mainland for months. Some manage to find a ship back to France, but 5 of the Calvinists decide to return to the island.
And what does Villegagnon do?
Hmm.
He arrests them, demands they recant their symbolic view of communion, and when they refuse, he literally drowns 3 of them in the bay.
He executes his own men over a point of theology. The internal religious implosion was catastrophic. The colony is deeply divided. Admiral Villegagnon actually becomes so disgusted with the religious tension that he abandons his post and sails back to France in 1558, leaving a fractured, demoralized garrison behind.
I am absolutely baffled by the tactical stupidity of this. Why on earth would a military commander intentionally drown his own men over a debate about communion when he knows for a fact that a heavily armed Portuguese fleet is inevitably coming to destroy them all?
From a purely military perspective, it is suicidal, but it perfectly illustrates a profound truth about these early colonial efforts. The colonists were not isolated from the traumas of Europe. They did not leave their ideological baggage at the docks in France.
The French wars of religion were a bloodbath, tearing the motherland apart.
The colonists imported that absolute life-or-death ideological civil war directly into the jungles of South America. To Villegagnon, the Calvinists weren't just insubordinate soldiers, they were demonic heretics, whose beliefs would bring the wrath of God down on the colony. To him, the spiritual threat of eternal damnation superseded the immediate military threat of the Portuguese.
And the Portuguese take full advantage of this self-inflicted weakness. In 1560, the new Governor-General of Brazil, Mendes, arrives in Guanabara Bay with a fleet of 26 warships and 2,000 soldiers. He attacks the fractured French garrison and destroys Fort Coligny in just 3 days.
The surviving French flee to the mainland to hide with their indigenous allies.
The Portuguese don't stop there. Mendes orders his nephew, Estácio de Sá, to permanently eliminate the French threat. In 1565, Estácio de Sá founds the city of Rio de Janeiro explicitly as a military base to root out the remaining Frenchmen. After 2 more years of jungle warfare, the Portuguese decisively expel the French from Brazil in 1567.
They try one more time in Brazil. In 1612, an expedition of 500 colonists founds equinoctial France in Maranhão, building the village of Saint Louis, known today as Saint Louis.
The records explicitly note that this colony was not a religious haven. Everyone was on the same theological page. Yet the outcome was identical. A Portuguese army defeated and expelled them less than 4 years later. São Luís remains the only Brazilian state capital founded by France.
Pushed out of South America, the French concentrated their southern efforts on the Caribbean islands. And this is where we see the economic engine of the empire finally ignite, but at a horrific human cost.
Let's look at the island of Hispaniola. In 1664, France formally establishes the colony of Saint-Domingue on the western third of the island. Saint-Domingue presents a radically different picture from the freezing starvation of Canada. It earns the nickname the Pearl of the Antilles.
Because it becomes the single richest colony in the entire Caribbean, pouring vast fortunes back into the French treasury.
The source of that immense wealth was the intensive, large-scale plantation production of sugarcane, along with coffee and indigo. Sugar was highly addictive and incredibly prized in Europe. But sugarcane is an incredibly labor-intensive crop to cultivate, harvest, and process.
To generate that wealth, the French relied on a system of absolute systemic brutality. The historical records state plainly that Saint-Domingue had the highest slave mortality rate in the entire Western Hemisphere.
The economic model of Saint-Domingue was highly efficient, but it was entirely dependent on a horrific premise. It was cheaper to literally work an enslaved human being to death in a few years and buy a replacement from Africa than it was to provide enough food, rest, and care to keep them alive.
The conditions in the sugar mills and the cane fields were a living nightmare of exhaustion, disease, and a violent punishment.
So you have a microscopic, white planter elite ruling over hundreds of thousands of brutally tortured, enslaved Africans. It's a powder keg, and in 1791, the spark is lit. A slave revolt begins.
The enslaved population, utilizing brilliant military organization and doubly motivated by the desire for sheer survival and liberty, rises up against the plantation owners. This sparks the Haitian Revolution. It is a long, incredibly bloody conflict, but it achieves something unprecedented.
In 1794, the French Republic is forced to abolish slavery in its colonies. And a decade later, after defeating the armies of Napoleon, the former slaves declare the complete independence of the country, renaming it Haiti.
The records note this is the only completely successful slave revolt in human history resulting in an independent state. Saint-Domingue is the ultimate tragic paradox of the southern colonies.
The French created an economic model that generated unprecedented wealth, but the sheer cruelty required to extract that wealth guaranteed the violent, permanent destruction of the colony itself.
When you look at the empire as a whole, the structural flaws are glaring. You have an impossibly underpopulated North America relying entirely on indigenous goodwill. You have internal religious strife undermining South American footholds. And you have a hyper-profitable but socially explosive reliance on brutal slavery in the Caribbean.
The entire French imperial structure was incredibly brittle. And as we move into the 18th century, that brittleness is tested. The rapidly expanding British colonies are pushing against the French borders. The constant friction finally causes the empire to shatter.
The 18th century for New France was defined by almost incessant, draining warfare. The French settlers, their indigenous allies, and the British colonists were constantly raiding each other. From 1689 to 1697, you have the 9 Years' War, known in America as King William's War. This is immediately followed by the War of the Spanish Succession, or Queen Anne's War.
The French military performs well initially. Quebec City successfully repels major British naval and army attacks in 1690 and again in 1711. But the geopolitical weight is shifting.
The demographic reality of that 20-to-1 population disadvantage begins to tell. The formal dismantling of the empire starts with the Treaty of Utrecht in 1713. France was exhausted by wars in Europe and could not hold all its American territory at the negotiating table.
By the terms of the Treaty of Utrecht, France is forced to cede Acadia, which had a population of about 1,700 French settlers. They also surrender their claims to Newfoundland and the vital trading outposts around Hudson Bay directly to Great Britain.
It is the beginning of the end. The British naval superiority is dictating the terms. France is losing the periphery of its empire, and the walls are closing in on the St. Lawrence and the Mississippi. The ultimate breaking point arrives with the 7 Years' War,
Also known as the French and Indian War in North America. The conflict begins over control of the Ohio River Valley. Despite the French possessing brilliant military commanders who utilize guerrilla tactics alongside their indigenous allies, the sheer mathematics of the conflict catch up to them.
You cannot fight a war of attrition when the enemy has 20 men for every one of yours. The British could absorb losses and continuously field new, well-supplied armies funded by their colonial agricultural economies and protected by the Royal Navy.
The French forces were stretched impossibly thin across thousands of miles of forest, with almost no reserves of manpower to call upon. Once the British capture the fortress of Louisbourg and then take Quebec City in 1759, the logistical spine of New France is broken.
The war ends with the Treaty of Paris in 1763. The terms are an absolute catastrophe for the French Empire. France is forced to cede Canada entirely to Great Britain. Furthermore, because their ally Spain had lost Florida to the British during the war, France compensates Spain by ceding the sprawling territory of Louisiana to them.
Just like that, with the stroke of a pen in Paris, 10 million square kilometers vanish from French control. The legal entity of the French Empire in North America is dissolved. The map is redrawn in pink for the British and yellow for the Spanish. There's a small footnote we mentioned earlier. During this transfer, the British take over the settlement of Mobile and immediately rename Fort Condé to Fort Charlotte.
There is one final, brief echo of the empire mentioned in the historical record. Decades later, in 1802, Spain actually returns the territory of Louisiana to France via a secret treaty.
But the world had changed. Napoleon Bonaparte is in charge of France now. He looks at Louisiana and realizes the exact same structural flaws exist. He has no naval power to defend it against the British, and the newly formed United States is expanding rapidly westward. He knows he cannot hold the territory.
Napoleon needs cash to fund his wars in Europe. So the very next year, in 1803, he sells the entirety of the Louisiana territory to the United States for $15 million. That sale definitively permanently ends the French imperial project on the North American mainland.
However, while the political control vanished, the cultural and linguistic legacy was so deeply entrenched that it remains vividly apparent today. We see it across the entire continent in toponyms, place names. You drive through states like Illinois and Vermont or navigate the bayous of Louisiana. Those are all French terms. We also see it in the ethnonyms, the names the French gave to Native American groups that are still used today, such as the Sioux, the Coeur d'Alene, and the Nez Perce.
The political borders were erased, but the cultural imprint of those early explorers, fur traders, and missionaries was permanently stamped onto the geography of the continent.
Every time you look at a map of the Americas today, you are, in a very real sense, looking at the ghosts of French ambition. It leaves you with a profound thought about how fragile history really is. Think about how entirely different the modern world would be if those early, desperate schemes to populate the continent had actually worked. What if John Law's propaganda had succeeded, and a booming organic French population had taken hold of the Mississippi River before the British arrived? Or consider what the political map of South America would look like today if the religious exiles in Brazil hadn't turned on each other and drowned their own men over theology, while the Portuguese fleet was massing on the horizon. The shape of our modern world is defined just as much by the empires that failed to hold their ground as by those that did. Thank you for listening. History Maps. Learn history visually.